Hi, this is a part two to the other video on the Ninth Amendment. At the end of that video, I had said the origins of the Ninth Amendment, when actually I meant to say original Bill of Rights. The history of the Ninth Amendment, okay. Okay, here it talks about what is a natural right. Natural rights are those rights that people have just because they are human. They are natural to mankind and should not be violated by the government. So things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment were judged by the Founding Fathers to be natural rights that the government cannot violate. Now, my question to you is, what decides what is a right and what decides what is a privilege? Now, it says here the Ninth Amendment clauses. The first part of the Ninth Amendment is called the enumeration of rights clause. It states that there are certain rights of the people which are which are specifically listed in the Constitution. It's like if you have a whole ton of ingredients in a recipe, but you grab 3 or 4 of the main items, such as salt, pepper, onions, and garlic. That's not all that goes in there. That's just as you're making a description of it, of what it's about. Those are the things that you mentioned, which are the main things that stand out. It takes all the ingredients in the recipe to make the recipe, like making a meatloaf. There's a lot more to meatloaf than just the meat and the onions and the bread that holds it together. There's a whole ton of other stuff, but the meat, the hamburger, maybe the crackers or whatever it is you use to piece it to hold it together, and then maybe some onion and maybe some peppers, and those would be the main things that stick out the most. But it takes more than that. And the person making the meatloaf didn't want to put down every single thing on paper that makes a meatloaf, because that might be the only way down the road people think you can make a meatloaf. But you can add other things. If you don't like peppers, you can add garlic. If you don't like garlic, you can add mushrooms. If you don't like mushrooms, you can add cheese or whatever it is you want to add. That's your right to do so, because it's your meatloaf. The way I make my meatloaf is for me. That's the way I like it. I like it basically just the hamburger. I like the crackers to hold it together and give it its shape. And I like to baste on some ketchup over the top and let it get nice and thick, so whenever you cut into it, you're not bogged down by a whole bunch of unnecessary stuff that doesn't have any flavor. Okay, the second part of the Ninth Amendment is called the Rights Retained by the People Clause, which means that the stuff that's not written down is the rights retained by the People Clause. This clause states that any right that naturally belongs to human beings. Now, there it's a kind of tricky thing, because when it says rights that naturally belong to a human being, how can you prove that that right belongs to you? When the government says that right doesn't belong to you, how are you able to prove that it does? Now, over time, we have gotten comfortable with the government saying that that's not a right, that's a privilege, such as right to free travel using the mode of transportation of the day in my life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The government wants to say that my right to get into my private property and take it anywhere I want is not a right. And you've got a lot of people out there that want to say, well, if you want to put your automobile in neutral and you want to push it, that's fine. That's not the way it goes. My automobile is private property until the United States government makes a law that says that automobiles are not private property, that they are not part of my property, such as my TV and my recliner chair, my computer, the camera that I'm using to videotape this with, the cell phone that I'm even reading this from. I own all of these. They're mine. They're private property, which means that they're not communal property. The automobile that I own is not communal property. It doesn't mean that 40 or 50 different people can borrow that. Now, one of those cars that you rent by the hour is communal property, because once you get done renting it, Our Car, I think is the name of it, you drop it off and somebody else gets in it and uses it. That's communal property. Automobiles were not made for communal property. Motorized vehicles made for commerce were considered communal property because they were made for more than one person to use them or possibly use them, such as semi-trucks. You have a semi-truck, but you got people that own those now, so they're privately owned commercial vehicles. Cabs, you may have a cab that somebody uses, and when they're done with their shift, somebody else uses it. That is communal property, which means that it's not private property because the person that's driving the said cab does not own that particular cab. Now, if he's a private cab owner, that's different. He owns his own cab, but he makes money off of the use of his cab. Now, it says here that the rights retained by the People Clause, this is the clause, states that any rights that naturally belong to human beings that are not specifically listed in the Constitution are still protected rights. In other words, the government still cannot infringe on those rights, even though the Constitution does not, even though the Constitution doesn't say it can't. Those rights are still retained by the people. So my right to free travel, in theory, is retained by me, but the federal government has figured out how to take that right and turn it into a privilege. Now, I'm going to give you a small story here. The Lakota Sioux Indians, I don't know if you recognize who they are, but the Lakota Sioux Indians were the property owners of the Black Hills. And the United States government made a treaty with the Lakota Sioux Indians back in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, that said, if you do not war with your tribes or any of the outlying settlers that are living there, not causing you any harm, they're just raising their children and plowing a field and things of that nature, we will give you all of the Lakota Sioux property, all the Black Hills area. That'll be yours for as long as it's there. Well, it wasn't that long after that they found gold on that property, and the settlers raced upon that property to get the gold, and the Indians were just foobarred. They tried to make a plea to the federal government, but the U.S. cavalry said, we're sorry, yes, technically you own the land, but there's too many settlers coming on your property, we can't stop them. So the Indians got screwed again. Technically the land belonged to the Lakota Sioux Indians, but because the people destroyed the land, the federal government said, I'm sorry, we can't stop them, we can't kick them off your property. So just like our right to free travel is part of a right retained by the people, using the mode of transportation of the day in a private property automobile that I feel like I want to transplant from place to place, Um, Technically, I can do that. But the federal government says that it's not a right. It is a privilege. Pretty soon, there will be other rights that we have that they'll turn into a privilege because we have no ability to prove that they are a right. We can say everything we want to say. We can make every kind of argument we want, but the federal government will come down and say it's not a right. It is a privilege because we can't claim that it is a right and prove that it is a right, like the right to free press and the right to freedom of speech and the right to assemble, the right to bear arms. Those are written down in the Constitution. And if those were not written down, the government would figure out how to take those away from us too. They're slowly taking away our rights. Now, my question to you is this: do you care? And if you do care, how much do you care? Are you happy with the little bit of freedom that you seem to have going through the course of your day? Getting up in the morning, getting ready for work, eating your breakfast, commuting to work, doing your work, taking your lunch break, clocking out at the end of the day and picking up your paycheck at the end of the week, going to the local bar and having a drink, going to the movies or what have you. Is that the extent of your freedom? Do you like that? Or would you rather have real, tangible, pure, unadulterated freedom? Now, the history of the Ninth Amendment. Why was the Ninth Amendment admitted to the Bill of Rights? After the Constitution was written by the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 and submitted to the United States for ratification, many voices arose saying the Constitution did not sufficiently protect the basic natural rights of the citizens. Now, back in those days, people understood things better than we do now. We have way too much junk to clutter our minds and fog up our memory and steam up our vision. Just like I'm wearing glasses because it's hard for me to see a little bit. My eyesight's not as clear as it used to be, but if my glasses got all steamed up, it would be hard for me to see wearing them. Now, back in those days, in the 1700s, people understood a little bit more what the rights were, and they understood when they said natural rights that are given to us. Those are rights that we have that were given to us by God. Just like when I lived on the farm, my dad decided he was going to drill for water. So he got a guy with a divining rod. The guy went around the backyard with a divining rod, which was a wood that looked kind of like a Y with a long ending on it. He held the two Y ends, and it was a brand new sapling. When it got close to water, it would bend down because it was trying to get to the water. My dad would drill, and all of a sudden water would come up out of the ground. That was put there by God for anything to use naturally. My dad happened to use it for our drinking water. It was very clear and very pure, and it was very good, and it was cold all year round. No matter when you took a drink out of it, it was clear, and it was cold, and it was pure water. Didn't have no crap in it like you have from the city water. That's like our rights that were given to us naturally. Those are perfect rights, like getting up in the morning, taking a breath, drinking water, things of that nature. Those are our rights that were given by the Creator. Man can come in and screw with those rights if he wants. He can make it so you can't drink. He can sew your lips shut in the middle of your sleep. He could kill you in the middle of your sleep so you can't get up in the morning, if God allows that to happen. Now, the Anti-Federalist Party in particular claimed that unless certain rights were spelled out in a Bill of Rights, the government could easily take over those rights and abuse the people. Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Mason were all of the anti-federalist opinion. Now, it appears to me that I have read you this before in the last video I made. The messages comes from James Madison of Congress, which presented his suggestion. Madison suggested amendments to solve the problem. Congress changed the wording slightly in the arrangement that we now know as the Ninth Amendment. So in the end, the Anti-Federalists won the argument and the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. Okay. This passage comes from James Madison, June 8th, 1789, it's a speech to Congress which presented his suggested amendments. It says here, it has been objected also against the Bill of Rights that by enumerating particular exceptions to the grant of power, it would disparage those rights which were not placed in that enumeration. Just because there were rights that weren't listed, people are afraid that the government could come in and destroy your right, just because it wasn't written down. And a lot of the government does that today. They'll say, it's not a right because it's not written down, or it's not real if it's not written down, or it's not important if it's not written down. I say that it is important, even though it's not written down. I believe that it's the government's responsibility to prove that it's not a right, and until they can prove that it's not a right, they have no business turning it into a privilege, even though they have done that and they've gotten away with it for so long that they assume that they can still get away with it. They still have to prove that a natural right is not a right and that it is a privilege. Now, what are your thoughts on the matter? Do you care about your rights? Do you care about having your rights taken away from you? Do you think that it's worth fighting for? Is it worth being uncomfortable for? I think it is, personally. That's just me. Now, I personally stand up for my rights every day. When I see a police officer doing something that's not right, I yell at him. Or I try to stop him. And I try to tell him that what he's doing is wrong. If I see somebody breaching somebody's rights, I try to stop them and say, you're not right, that you do not have the ability to do that. You were not granted permission to take a right and turn it into a privilege. And they want to argue, how can you tell that it's a right and not a privilege? And I said, well, how can you tell that it's a privilege and not a right? That's what I asked him. And I did that in court with the judge. When the judge told me that I did not have the right to free travel, I said, well, how do you know that I don't have that right? And she said, because I said so. And I said, so that's it? It's not a right because you said so? Okay, well, if I was in power and I was in authority, could I say that you don't have the right to breathe because it's not written down and I say it's not a right? She would say, or the judge would say, you can't do that. And I would say, why not? Like I did in court. I said it is up to the political powers, it is up to the judicial system to prove that a right is not a right. Because really, if you think about it, there is nothing that the government can do if the Ninth Amendment holds true. There is nothing that the Ninth Amendment can do that would be a privilege. I have a right to operate a business. Now they can say I have to pay taxes on that, but then again, by paying taxes to the federal government for my business, I am therefore also being turned into an indentured servant, which is not right. So anyway, that's the video for this. That's part 2. It's going to be kind of short this time, I guess, because I'm trying to lower the time that I make the videos. So anyway, that's been all things considered, because I consider all things.